Deputy Director of the Center on Terrorism, Extremism,
On
and Counterterrorism.
the
Yes.
it's the preposition is important. That's what you're
Yes.
studying on. You're looking on it. And today, in your world as a studier and a researcher of the extremist groups in the world in the United States, the Kyle Rittenhouse verdict just came down just this hour and acquitted of all counts against him of manslaughter of the victims that he shot
Yeah.
during a protest last year in 2020. First off, were you surprised at the verdict itself?
I wasn't surprised. I think there's historical precedent for this sort of thing being seen as uh this particular sort of scenario being seen as self-defense. It's pretty common within sort of the way that um Americans in the general sort of identity way that we might describe them, it's common for them to treat that sort of interaction as self-defense and as acquittable, I guess. So I wasn't particularly surprised, and I think that there have been signs coming from the judge and from sort of other hints from the courtroom that it was going to happen. Doesn't make me any less disappointed, but I cannot say that I was shocked.
From day one, from when the incident occurred, Rittenhouse has been given shelter, support through money and places to stay from some of the very groups that you study and research, these extremism groups. Why is he um, such a powerful symbol for these groups?
He was seen early on and continues to be seen as sort of one of the only examples from the 2020 protests of people who align themselves, either openly or just through action with sort of like Boogaloo movement style, vigilante justice, militia group activism, who would actually go out there and sort of walk the walk in addition to talking the talk. The majority of Boogaloo adherents that we saw last year during the protests did nothing more than stand menacingly in front of Hobby Lobbies with, assault rifles. And there's something in the minds of the people who are celebrating him, they see something different in what Rittenhouse did. They see someone who not only was young, but also like was willing to go out and literally walk the streets and take action, actually start, letting bullets fly. And so in that way, he was seen sort of as this rallying point for the hopes and dreams that had otherwise fizzled out about the Boogaloo movement, about potential revolutionary activism. Um, so much, so many different expectations and hopes have been pinned on him since then. As a result of that, he's become far larger than life. He's become this central hero for killing two people in the streets, which even though he was acquitted, everyone agreed that he did kill those people. um so it was one of those things where, like, because he was one of the only examples of people to actually take that sort of deadly action in the midst of the protests last year, he has become sort of the hero for every far right group out there.
So is the thing that I'm terrifyingly imagining is his face on t-shirts like a rock star or a movie star. Is that something that a nightmare scenario you have as well?
It's already happened. There's already people been walking around with shirts and signs saying Kyle Rittenhouse did nothing wrong. That slogan's been thrown around in every far right or every right wing group, from like your normal pro Trump groups all the way over to the extreme neo Nazi accelerationist right. They've made. I've seen mugs. I've seen sweatshirts. I've seen all manner of merch branded with his face and that slogan. So he has fully become part of the sort of mobilizing material that is used in the American right.
And that's as these groups work to radicalize young people, he is held up as a role model, I would assume. This is what you can be.
Yes, yeah, exactly. He is held up, especially by the more violent, the more accelerationist groups, as the example of what you can do, the example of the heroism that you can attain if you are to go out and take activism. He's already been sanctified. This is a trend among far right groups. They will sanctify terrorists and mass shooters. They will literally call them like saint whatever in their chats, and that is a sort of discrete or intentional tactic that they use for recruiting and mobilizing more people to be that. It's their way of showing potential other terrorists or potential other recruits, hey, like if you go out and take action, you will have this legacy among your peers. You will have this sort of larger in life persona and reputation. And he's already been called Saint Kyle among all manner of different groups, in particular the extreme, accelerationist right, and even more specifically Christian identity, and sort of the extreme Christian accelerationist right.
As the media covers the acquittal today and the trial, are they finding that? Are they bringing that point out, or are they skipping over this sort of sainthood from the extremism groups in their reporting?
I mean, I think it's probably still too early to tell. It started a few weeks ago. I mean, it's been his sort of like martyrdom, for lack of a better term. His idolization has been going for several months, but the specific sanctification has been the last couple of weeks. My hope is that the media will cover it correctly in the coming days. I've been talking with journalists and helping them understand what's going on. I will say it is a hard balancing act, even for myself. Like you have to sort of walk this razor line between um, giving too much information and accidentally promoting extremist propaganda, and also calling out the fact that he is being held up as this mobilizing point, as this example to try to get other people to commit vigilante violence as well. In this very particular way that links him to like the Christchurch mass shooter, the El Paso mass shooter, various other right wing terrorists over the last 10 years. So I, you know, I'm trying to help the best I can with journalists who come to ask me. So far, I've heard from several, and they seem to be doing it pretty well. But it is like this is one of the most challenging parts about covering and about doing this sort of research, is finding that really really fine line between you know giving the knowledge the public needs to understand this, and that can hopefully affect policymaking and responses down the road, and also inadvertently promoting far right propaganda.
Is If it had gone differently, if he had not been acquitted, would this have furthered work to stop extremism and radicalization? And does this now mean that that work is easier to do to radicalize people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting counterfactual thought experiment, because we know like if he was found guilty, what would have happened is that his example would have been used among certain far right groups to characterize the system as inherently corrupt, which feeds into accelerationist goals of designating all of it as basically irredeemable and worthy of destruction, of nothing other than destruction. But my personal opinion is that acquittals are more sticky. I think they are more powerful in the mainstream, in sort of the broader set of actors who are involved in the right wing, because it gives a sort of touch point between that connects everyone from like your mainstream QAnon adherents and Trump supporters all the way over to the far right extremist accelerationist crew. It is a much harder sell for the neo Nazis and the neo fascists to say, "Hey, mainstream Trumper, just you should reject everything entirely." And Rittenhouse's, conviction is a sign of that, rather than you know capitalizing on the acquittal and saying, "Look, even the inherently degenerate system also has given Rittenhouse a pass and thinks that what Rittenhouse did wasn't bad. Um, let's go do more of it. Let's go, feed on his example, build on his example, use it as a blank check to go, do more radicalization, do more mobilization." And it's yeah, I mean, it gives the extreme violent neo-Nazi crowd an excuse to make more and stronger connections with the less extreme crowds, in a way that I don't think really happens if he was convicted.
Is it the thing that you just described sort of makes me feel like it might have been a no-win scenario either way the trial went?
Yeah, and I mean, no one would have won. I think the the alternative of him getting convicted, I think would have been better for the rule of law, would have been better for sort of broad faith in the justice system. But ultimately, there really wasn't any sort of perfect way out of this. There would have been additional radicalization happening regardless. There would have been probably, we still have to see what happens in the aftermath of this, but my guess is either way there would have been sort of additional skirmishes in the streets and confrontations among the different factions. But I do still have to think that a full acquittal is ultimately worse for the long term. I've been talking about this a lot, but there is some historical precedent for historical acquittals in the far right being used for additional violence and additional radicalization. One of the best examples of this is the Greensboro massacre that happened in 1979, when a variety of far right individuals essentially murdered people in the streets and were later acquitted on all charges, like murdered unarmed people, basically. They came ready for a war and ended up killing a number of people in Greensboro and were let off. And later on, the people who were brought up on those charges, the Ku Klux Klan and neo Nazis who were brought up, were held up again as sort of an example of what to do, of a sign, sort of like a beacon to follow for other movement members. And in fact, it was often frequently used in conjunction with incitement to violence later on as like, hey, these guys got off scot-free. This is tacit endorsement from the system that what we're doing is correct. And so we should keep doing it. And we should keep building on it.
You've got a really busy evening and a weekend ahead of you now, sort of processing the news and looking at the news and thinking about it and writing about it, I'm sure. One last question for you. Thank you so much for taking some time this afternoon. Is I want to leave some space to think about the victims. Like,
Yeah.
are the victims of his actions and their families, they get so lost in some of these discussions. How do you feel and reflect on their loss of lives and what that means for our country?
Yeah. I mean, this should never happen. Like this, people should not feel afraid for their lives when they're going to protest. Like enshrined in the US's sort of founding values is the right to assembly, is the right to express your sort of dissatisfaction with the state of the political system, obviously in a peaceful way. And the people who went to that protest and were killed were not expecting to get in a street fight with someone holding an assault rifle. Like that is not something that should happen, and is just truly, it was just a truly tragic turn of events that that someone went out there, and from all signs, from all evidence we have, someone went out there looking for that sort of fight, and the victims ended up being the ones who got caught in that. We need to reflect on the fact that like this happens far too often, and it happens far too often in ways that we don't see and don't bubble up in the media. People end up getting run over by cars at protests. People end up getting, other sorts of consequences happen to them completely unfairly, just for trying to express themselves. And it's also worth remembering that the reason why the victims were there in the first place was to protest against police brutality and in support of Black equality and civil rights. And it is truly just like unspeakably tragic that they would lose their lives in pursuit of, in protest of values that I think, are should be held up and should be celebrated.
Thank you, Alex. I'm going to stop our stream. We'll say goodbye on Discord. Thank you. Hang on one moment.